Good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion of David Novak's In Defense of Religious Liberty. Religious freedom is one of our key areas of interest. My colleague Tom Farr, who will be doing the introductions in a second, leads our program on religion and U.S. foreign policy, and religious freedom is one of the key leitmotifs of his work in that program and his work more broadly. The focus of our work is really on religious freedom as a foreign policy issue, on how to approach it, how to think about it. And this afternoon, we'll be able to touch on that, I'm sure, but perhaps more indirectly, and explore the concept of religious freedom, its application to democratic contexts, both national, perhaps also international, in different ways. And we've got a great group together to help us explore these issues in more depth, using Rabbi Novak's book as a jumping off point. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Tom Farr. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to all to the Berkeley Center for what promises to be an intellectually stimulating and perhaps even entertaining. I am not going to make a formal or extended introduction of these three gentlemen for a couple of reasons. One, I think many of you are aware of them and their work, and we have given you handouts that will give you a précis of the very impressive lives that we have represented in Rabbi David Novak, Bill Galston, and George Weigel. I will, however, take the liberty of pointing out that they are all three returning to the Berkeley Center. They have participated in seminars and other events that we have had, symposia that we've had here. George Weigel has been gracious enough to come to my classroom on a number of occasions. And Bill Galston has participated, among other things, in a symposium we had on the future of international religious freedom policy, in which he talked about one of his many areas of expertise, public diplomacy. And of course, tonight, sort of the centerpiece of our focus, Rabbi David Novak has participated in a symposium on political theology, which is not without relevance to the issue that we're going to talk about tonight, which of course is his book In Defense of Religious Liberty. If you haven't already read this book, I dare say you're going to want to read it after this evening. Let me just set the stage briefly by posing the question, why does religious freedom need defending? After all, every international covenant proclaims the importance of religious freedom. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, presents it as one of the non-derogable rights in the panoply of fundamental rights that virtually every country in the world is signed up to. I saw this morning that I think 76% of the countries in the world guarantee religious freedom in their constitutions. In the United States, we call this the first freedom, not only because it's the first of the 10 Amendments, but because we traditionally have thought of it as having a pride of place among those fundamental rights that we call inalienable rights. So what's the problem? Well, obviously the problem is the difference between rhetoric and reality. The Pew Forum last month put out the results of an exhaustive study entitled, I think it's The Global Restrictions of Religion Report. And its bottom line was rather startling. I hope you'll agree. 70% of the population of the world live in countries in which restrictions on religious freedom are either high or very high. 70% of the population of the world. We are not going to talk, however, about the difficulties experienced by most of those people tonight, many of whom experience the kind of persecution that's associated with torture or rape or disappearance, modern neologism for kidnapping somebody and murdering. We're going to talk about the perils of religious freedom, not in Saudi Arabia or China or Russia or India, but in the United States and Canada. So, Rabbi Novak, thank you for coming.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here, both at Georgetown University, which is my alma mater. I took my PhD here in philosophy in 1971, believe it or not, and to be back here at the Berkeley Center where I, just as Tom indicated, I participated in a program on political theology just a while back, and in fact, coming in here, I ran into Michael Kessler, who ran that program, and apparently the papers are just on the verge of being published by a major publisher, so that's good news. In Defense of Religious Liberty began as three lectures that I gave, the test lectures at Princeton under the auspices of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, which is run by my good friend Professor Robert George, and in fact the book is dedicated to Robbie George. Those three lectures dealing with religious liberty as a political issue, a philosophical issue, and a theological issue. And then some other papers dealing with questions of rights, picking up on some of my earlier work on rights theory, arguing that notions of human rights are within the Jewish tradition from the very beginning, that human rights are not an invention of post-Enlightenment modernity. And the last essay here, Law, Religious, or Secular, where I think I make a very provocative claim that all law ultimately or primarily is religious, is a claim of a higher power upon those who are both being ruled and being benefited by that higher power, which for anyone within Jewish, Christian, Islamic traditions could only be the one God. Getting to the question of in defense of religious liberty, there's a threefold claim that is made for what do we mean by religious liberty? And the first claim that's made for religious liberty might be what is referred to as the metaphysical claim. And it's a metaphysical claim that my relationship with the God whose revelation has been preserved and transmitted by the community of which I am a member has liberated me from being subject to the processes of the world, and especially to ultimate death. That has redeemed me from death, has redeemed me or my community of which I am part from, as it were, going the way of all flesh. That is the most important sense of religious liberty, but it's not the sense I'm dealing with in this book. The second sense of religious liberty might be referred to as the sociological notion of religious liberty, and that is that I believe we have a claim to be able to worship God any way we want to worship God or not worship God, affirm God or not affirm God, and the question of which God and out of which tradition, which is normally considered to be religious liberty. Certainly the metaphysical claim is not controversial in many circles simply because any metaphysical claim is considered to be ridiculous. So if people want to maintain this, as long as they're not harming anybody, well, okay, let them have their fantasies. As for the sociological claim, there would seem to be little objection to that a group of people want to get together and go through certain rites and practices and whatever. These are private associations, and it's no different than any other form of recreation. Some people like to go to a church or a synagogue. Some people like to go to a health club. Some people like to play video games. As far as that's concerned, little questioning. The questioning of religious liberty arises in the context of, do I have the liberty, will society protect my right to bring the moral insights of my religious tradition into public discussion? That is what is extremely controversial. It's controversial because the argument is that a moral perspective formed in a religious context. And what one means by a religious context is not a deistic notion of religion, of somehow, worship of God, the creator of nature, but rather a very specific sort of worship, the God who reveals himself to Moses and the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, the God who reveals himself through Jesus of Nazareth, the God who speaks to Muhammad. The notion that I can bring these moral principles, even moral norms, into public discussion is problematic from two sides. It's problematic from a secular society itself, and I would define a secular society as not an officially atheistic society, but a society that does not take its warrant from any particular revelation. A society that does not take its warrant from any particular revelation. Now, in that sense, if I am bringing my perspective from this very particularistic, historically situated community of which I've grown up and whose tradition I have accepted and am attempting to transmit and interpret and transmit, then is it not, the question is, who are you to ram your religion down everybody's throat? It's very nice for the people who, in your community, who want to live that way. That's okay, as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. But the notion that you should bring this into the public square is something which is considered to be illegitimate. And this was actually, this whole question was a subject of a debate that I had a number of years ago when I was at the University of Virginia with the late Richard Rorty, who was my colleague at the University of Virginia. We both wrote up in respective books about it. It was a debate, can the name of God be uttered in public? It was held at the First Presbyterian Church of Charlottesville, Virginia, and apparently made an impression on both Rorty and myself, because we both wrote about it in different places. But this is the question. Can one do this sort of thing? And it is challenged by those who would say that that religion is a private matter, consenting individuals, not something that cannot be brought into a public discourse. From the side of somebody within a religious tradition, there are those within my community and other religious communities as well who say that basically we should be as little interested in the outside world as possible. We should only be interested in it when they're attempting to, shut us down in terms of what we're doing in our own communities. But other than that, and other than kind of minimal loyalty to a state so that we can, be citizens and get the benefits of citizenship, it's a sectarian notion that one sees among various Mennonite groups in the Christian tradition, one sees it among Hasidim, among Jews, is let the outsider, let them take care of themselves. We're really not part of that world. We're only participants in it in a very narrow sense, and therefore, so be it. I think both of these positions, and this is the primary thrust of the book, are mistaken. Now let me go back to my own tradition. My own tradition, as does the Christian tradition, and I'm told by a colleague of mine, a very distinguished scholar of Islamic law at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, that it's also part of Islam. There are aspects of the Jewish tradition which are considered to be universally significant morally. So that, for example, if somebody says to me, who are you to, ram your religion down my throat because you're opposed to elective abortion, I can say, yes, but my tradition also says thou shalt not kill, even if it's not a question of born life. Let's forget about unborn life for a moment. And that's clearly something that you would accept, and yet it does come from, at least it's in my tradition, it's been there an awful long time. So in that way, there is this, what I would call this universal horizon. Now, the universal horizon can be presented in one of two ways. When it is presented in an authoritarian way, that is, I speak from the authority of my tradition. God commanded Moses, XYZ, to be told to the people of Israel, and I come either literally or figuratively with a Bible in hand and say that therefore this is what my tradition says everybody should be doing, then rightly so, I should be questioned as simply, who are you? I don't accept the authority of your tradition. Therefore, if I don't accept the authority of your tradition, how can you say that it possibly has authority over me? Are you attempting to proselytize me or not? So that is the question that has to be dealt on that side. The way I think that it's handled in the Jewish tradition, or at least a part of the Jewish tradition, because it's a debated question, as it's debated in every question, is that what the tradition teaches as universally morally binding is not its own invention. In other words, thou shalt not kill did not begin as a commandment of Mount Sinai, and before that nobody knew about it or accepted it. But rather, Mount Sinai, the revelation of Mount Sinai, confirmed certain universal moral norms that were considered to be in place already. And in fact, according to this part of the Jewish tradition that I identify with, the school of thought within the Jewish tradition, that a people who are not living under certain universal norms considered to be God-given at creation would have been in no position to accept the higher revelation and authority of God at a place like Mount Sinai. So that therefore, the argument from the tradition is not from the tradition's authority, it's from the tradition's wisdom. And this is a distinction that is made especially in medieval Jewish theology between the wisdom of God and the will of God. Yes, it is rooted in the will of God, but we argue the wisdom of God, and we can argue for the wisdom of certain moral precepts, certain moral principles, even with those who do not accept our theological premises. In other words, that our morality is not deduced from our theology. It is rather, in a way, grounded by our theology, but one doesn't have to accept that grounding in order to be able to enter into the conversation in a very Habermasian sort of way. On the other side, the question is, who are you to bring these teachings from your tradition into the public square? Is the assumption, which I think has been belied by the great philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, that somehow or other religious people are bringing all this material from their historical traditions, but everyone else in society, which, by the way, turns out to be in North America a minority, except in certain centers, really begins in a Rawlsian sense behind a veil of ignorance, as it were, de novo, coming to the table, coming to the social contract with no background whatsoever, no interest, economic interest, no cultural interest, and culture, of course, is deeply connected with religion. What MacIntyre has pointed out against that liberal argument is that that type of liberalism is the only tradition which has the arrogance to claim it's not a tradition. That everyone has this problem, or perhaps a challenge, of how do they negotiate coming into this larger, universal, secular sphere without either being done in by it, by their religious commitment becoming simply something which is tolerated by the secular state, and on the other hand, not coming in a triumphalist, arrogant, chauvinistic, political proselytizing kind of mode. And this is what I attempt to deal with here in the book. The last point that I want to make, because I really want to hear from George Weigel and Bill Galston, is in the section of religious liberty as a philosophical claim. I have there a very interesting, I think it's interesting, so, hope you think it's interesting, a disagreement with somebody whom I've never met, although I've read his work and seen him, Alan Dershowitz, about the notion of unalienable rights. The famous phrase, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase. Now, Dershowitz, in his book on the Declaration of Independence, regards that as simply kind of fluff. It's something that was a kind of a throwaway line. It was something he had to say because there were a lot of churchgoers during his time, but it's not something that he really believed. It's not something that's important. It's not something which is considered to be founding. And when I read that in Dershowitz's book, and I discuss it here, I remember a lecture, one of these lectures that you never forget as an undergraduate, by a great American historian called Avery Craven, who argued, I remember this is the University of Chicago, I can still picture him on the podium there, and saying that basically the Declaration of Independence was the true preamble to the Constitution of the United States, and that when there's a clash between the letter of the law in the Constitution, as it were, and the spirit of the law in the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence trumps the Constitution and calls for reinterpretation if there's that type of clash. And he cited the slavery debate as that sort of thing. So in that way, it's clearly not something which is considered to be, I consider to be a throwaway line. And especially now that since I am both a citizen of the United States, the land of my birth, and also a citizen of Canada, and when I became a citizen of Canada, I actually had to learn the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which begins, whereas Canada is founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, which I read as phrases in apposition, that the supremacy of God is the rule of law, because law is fundamentally, or in its roots, divine, or given by God. Now, in that way, I am not arguing in the book for the type of natural theology that Jefferson was referring to. No, the type of natural theology that basically says that from the events of external nature, we can, if not prove, but at least strongly indicate that there is a creator God with the reason and purpose, created the world such and such, and therefore our morality is finding how we kind of fit our way into this cosmic kind of picture. I don't think that is a very tenable way of arguing philosophically after Kant. My notion there of God endowing rights is the claim that the human person as the image of God, the claims made by a human person for their life, liberty, and the pursuit of their happiness is something which is theirs to claim because they are the special object of divine concern. Now, the question is, can I prove that? Can I even indicate that such is the case in the way that the classic proofs of the existence of God? No. But I can argue for its heuristic value. And here, even though he's not mentioned in the book, I found certain affinities between the way I do this and the way Nicholas Wolterstorff, very distinguished Calvinist philosopher and theologian, has argued as well. In other words, that one can postulate this as giving what I would consider to be the most coherent explanation of why we argue for the sanctity of human life, which is another book that I wrote, which is also published by Georgetown University Press, but the same type of arguments. So that the book presents, therefore, that type of an argument philosophically, that this can be presented just like a postulate, which cannot be proven, but has value in terms of explanatory or heuristic power. The last aspect of the book that I just want to emphasize now is that it deals with a political, a philosophical, and a theological argument. And my point there is that on any issue, under any major moral issue, which is always a major issue in public, since just as there's no such thing as a private language, I don't think there's such a thing as a private morality. And that these issues, for a person coming from a thick religious tradition like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, has to be, first of all, for yourself, has to be argued theologically. Is this something that you can regard as either warranted by your tradition or at least not contradicted by its teachings? The second aspect is that is this something for which one can make an argument of public reasoning in a Habermasian, perhaps even Rawlsian sense, in public, simply where one's tradition is more likely not considered to be, at least in public, the cause of your argument, but rather simply the conditio sine qua non, that it hasn't violated what your tradition teaches. And the last aspect is the political argument, which means that there are certain things that can be argued for philosophically which still are politically unfeasible. In other words, that politically these are simply it will be counterproductive to argue for kind of public enforcement of certain norms. You have to understand it's very much what Thomas Aquinas called the political virtue of prudence, of understanding where things can be applied, where they cannot be applied. Unfortunately, this is true of my own community, true of other communities, the arguments usually begin right at the political level. That should be the last step, for frequently it's the first step. And therefore, what happens is that religious groups become special interest groups, special pleading type of groups, who basically come into society, make an argument, and the argument frequently degenerates to the point where, well, I think everybody should do this because this is what my religion teaches, and if you don't endorse this, we're not going to vote for you in the next election. I mean, it frequently degenerates almost to that kind of point. But rather, it should begin at the reflection. In other words, that if I'm involved in certain public policy questions, which I have been over time, the first thing that I have to do is this something that I can sell to my friend Eugene? Who is Eugene? Eugene is a Hungarian Jew, came to Canada in 1956. He sits next to me in the synagogue every Saturday morning. He's an educated man, a thoughtful man, but not somebody who gets involved in these issues. So when he asks me, what are you up to? Why are you going to Washington? Why are you going to Ottawa, where I just was involved something with the Canadian government? I have to be able to make an argument to him that this is something that is not, according to the Jewish tradition, considered to be what's called bittul zman, that I'm wasting my time, I'm wasting my energies, that this is something that really has a basis in the Jewish tradition. Then I develop the philosophical argument, talking with people who come from other traditions, usually in an academic context. And then at times there is the political application, and one has to have the political virtue of prudence to know when to see it as politically feasible and when to see it as not politically feasible. But the point is to begin at the theological end and then come to the political end, not begin at the political end where you define yourself not as what you really are, which is a member of, certainly for Jews and Christians, member of a people elected by God, given a revelation, and told to transmit it and wait till the end of time when the Messiah comes or comes again, depending on your theology. Then it enables one to function as much more than the usual special pleading and special interest groups that we're so used to seeing, certainly in Washington, but anywhere where politics becomes an issue. So anyway, this was why I put the book together, based upon the lectures, based upon some other papers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what George and Bill have to say, and hopefully we can include folks here as well. And it'll certainly be a good experience for me, and I hope for you as well. Thank you.
Bill? Yes, please.
See you, but not what I need to see even more than I need to see you. Well, as is the case with every one of David Novak's book that I encounter, I find much, much more to agree with than to disagree with. And so let me state the points of agreement so that I can sharpen the point of disagreement. Does religion have a public dimension, a legitimate public dimension? Yes, absolutely. Details to come. Does religion provide the basis for a justifiable claim against what might otherwise be plenipotentiary state authority? Yes, absolutely. Is religious liberty worth defending? You bet. Can it be defended on the basis of religious or theological arguments? Absolutely. That's a lot to agree on. Now let me state the one point of disagreement on which I'll focus my remarks. Is it the case that if you probe deeply enough, religion is the only basis on which religious liberty and by extension all of our rights as human beings can be defended. I think David Novak's answer to that question is yes, and I would like to say in these remarks, not so fast. That's what the next 12 minutes will be about. So let me try to first lay out Novak's argument as I understand it, and then interrogate it from a couple of points of view. As you've already heard, he begins with a negative argument, I think a very frank one, that neither revealed theology nor natural theology can work as the public basis for the assertion of rights, at least in a modern liberal democracy. Revealed theology won't work because it proceeds on the basis of premises particular to a specific religious community rather than premises available to all conscientious citizens. Natural theology of the sort that Jefferson gestures towards in the Declaration of Independence is rejected, Novak believes, or it must be rejected, because it neither makes sense in its own terms, post-Kant, nor leads to the necessary moral conclusions about human life. That raises the following question, Novak suggests. If neither revealed theology nor natural theology works as the basis for rights in a modern liberal democracy, then is a secular or even atheistic argument the only alternative. And Novak says, no, it isn't, for two reasons. And there's an affirmative reason about an effective theological argument and a negative reason, namely the ineffectiveness of secular arguments. So, first, the affirmative argument. There is a form of religious argument, Novak suggests, which is neither revealed nor natural, that both makes sense and does the necessary work as the ground of religious liberty and rights in general. He bases this on what he calls a radical reading of the Declaration of Independence, and he bases this radical reading on a fascinating and compelling text. And it is something written by a Polish concentration camp survivor by the name of Pelagia Lewińska, an interesting religious reference in itself. And here's what she has to say. They had condemned us to die in our own filth. They wished to abase us, to destroy our human dignity, to efface every vestige of humanity, to fill us with horror and contempt toward ourselves and our fellows. But from the instant I grasped the motivating principle, it was as if I had been awakened from a dream, and then Lewińska said, I felt under orders to live. That's the crucial sentence that Novak, in effect, stresses, and which I want to stress as well. So, what does that mean? Well, Lewińska, Novak is saying, is asserting the right to life not just as an endowment, not just as an option, but in effect as a command. So, the right to life in the Declaration of Independence on this reading means, to put it Jewishly, choose life. You have no choice but to affirm life, to pursue it for yourself, and to try to preserve it for all others. Now, in Novak's account, the experience of being commanded in this way doesn't rest on any specific historical or revealed religious tradition, but it's not a part of natural theology either. It might be called, although Novak doesn't use this phrase, existential theology. There is a sense of being, there is a sense or experience of being commanded, which implies a commander. And that is the sequence that leads from the language of rights to the idea of a commander, capital C, as the basis of the rights that we can affirm. And this argument is buttressed by a broader count of morality that Novak offers. He claims that moral norms make sense only as commandments. And commandments make sense only if used as heteronymous, that is, from some will outside ourselves. And from that, he draws the conclusion that in principle, religion and morality cannot be separated. So that's the affirmative argument for his position. The negative argument for his position is that the secularist or atheist position fails to provide a secure basis for the rights that we claim against the state. And so he says, for example, and I quote, "So those who claim that de facto atheism is the only cogent basis for commitment to a democratic polity have no basis for rationally challenging the unjust exercise of state authority, which is the very antithesis of constitutional democracy. Without God, atheists must see liberty as a gift of the state and not a claim against the state." So, this is a very rough sketch of the strand of Novak's argument that I want to focus on. And now I want to raise three problems with this argument. My point of departure is his point of departure, what I'll call the animating experience, the experience of being commanded, the experience that this Holocaust survivor, Pelagio Lewinsky, reported. And I want to raise the following question. Is this experience of rights universal? Is it the experience on the basis of which all rights ought to be understood, or is it a highly particular experience? It is understandable, I believe, that threats to life from some of the most evil human beings who've ever stalked the face of the earth might evoke a particular kind of resistance to their evil, interpreted as a command. But is this a universal revelatory experience providing insight into the essential status of rights? It's not clear to me that it is. If I had a lot more time, I would compare Pelagio Lewinsky's experience with the experience of another concentration camp survivor, namely Primo Levi. And that contrast would distinguish sharply between the choose life command on the one hand and the right to life, life as something surrenderable on the other. The second question I want to raise about Novak's argument is, with the argument itself motivated by an interpretation of Lewinsky's utterance. Here's the essence of his position as I understand it. Let me reduce it to three propositions for philosophical clarity. Number one, to have a right to X is to be morally required to choose and pursue X. Proposition two, to be morally required to choose and pursue X is to be commanded to do so. And proposition three, there can be no command without a commander understood as some will different from and external to what is commanded. Now, let me say a bit about each one of those three propositions and then conclude these remarks. Concerning proposition one, rather than understanding rights as requirements, it's more usual and more plausible, I believe, to view rights as permissions to act in certain ways. That is, as creating a zone of choice protected against external interference. So even though by hypothesis, if you take the Declaration of Independence at face value, we have a right to pursue happiness, we also have a right to act in ways that we know will not maximize our happiness in the name of some other goal or some other good. We are entitled to pursue happiness, but not commanded or obligated to do so. Concerning the second proposition that makes up Novak's argument, even if we grant for the sake of argument that rights are requirements, it does not follow that they are commands. After all, there are lots of requirements that aren't commands. For example, reason requires us to accept conclusions validly inferred from major and minor premises, but it would be odd to say that reason commands us to do so. And so, if rights are rational requirements, then they aren't commands. They are obligatory, but in a non-command sense of obligation. Concerning the third proposition that makes up Novak's argument. Even if we grant for the sake of argument that rights are commands, it does not follow that they are commanded by some will external to the individuals who are commanded. For example, Kant's doctrine of autonomy is, among other things, an account of commands understood internally rather than externally, as the prompting of practical reason within us over and against the empirically driven will. So Novak's argument presupposes, and I think must presuppose, that no account along Kantian lines is coherent or cogent.
Right on.
Finally, and I'll have to do this very quickly, I have a problem with Novak's rather brisk rejection of secular accounts of rights against the state. I think he gives, if I put it this way, rather short shrift to those arguments. He does not really engage the argument that a case for religious liberty can be made by looking empirically at what happens when regimes deny it. The wars of religion that had such an important effect on the European imagination. And secondly, Lockean arguments about the nature of belief itself and the inaptitude of compulsion or oppression in relation to that understanding of belief. Finally, and this will be my conclusion, Novak, without quite saying so, provides the basis for his own secular account of rights. And here are a couple of things he says. I quote, "If law is to intelligently order our interpersonal desires in such a way that the common good is properly served, how could that law be the product of the desires of any of those who need to be governed by it?" Which is a fair question. Does Novak's conclusion follow? And I quote, "Thus law must come from the desire or will of someone not governed by it. Once there is an externally imposed law on our desires, there is a God of some sort." To which I reply, what about rational inferences drawn from human nature and human needs? And here's what Novak has to say about that. In the natural world, he says, that is, the world not based on historical revelation, the claims of the Creator God on his creatures are totally mediated. There's a key phrase, totally mediated by the justifiable claims one human being makes upon another. These claims are direct and evident to all. They do not require prophetic revelation. What justifies such claims? And Novak replies, one could say that human nature is the sum of essential human needs, that is, those needs that a satisfactory life for any human being requires. Amen, Rabbi Novak. I think you've just provided what I would take as the basis for a secular account of human rights and religious liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow. Wow.
Good evening. When I find myself in the presence of Tom Farr, who has done more than anyone to give intellectual foundation to the notion of international religious freedom as an issue for U.S. foreign policy, David Novak, who is at the center of what he once described accurately as a form of Jewish-Christian dialogue that of a depth that simply hasn't been available for 1900 years, and Bill Galston, who has, perhaps more than anyone in my lifetime, tried to bring serious political philosophy to bear on the tasks of governance. I feel I have to begin by saying Domini non sum dignus, a phrase that one used not to have to translate on this campus. Let me illustrate my unworthiness by leaving the realms of political theory and providing a bridge in this last part of our conversation to certain questions, issues, and controversies in which, of course, the theoretical issues are engaged in the business of answering the question, how ought we to live together? Those of us of a certain age may remember that it was about 20 years ago that a friend of several of us here, Frank Fukuyama, announced that history was over, that with the triumph of the West in the Cold War, the large questions of the organization of society, polity, and economy had answered, and Frank suggested while this was somewhat satisfying from the point of view of Democrats, small d, and free market advocates, life was going to be rather boring for the foreseeable future. Well, that, of course, didn't happen. Life quickly became interesting and indeed, in some respects, terrifying again. But it might have been suspected that of all of the large questions settled by the decisive defeat of the last of the great totalitarian systems of the 20th century in the revolution of 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the question of religious freedom, which had been deeply implicated in the torment of the 20th century, the greatest century of persecution, and of course not of religious persecution, and of course not only of Christians in recorded human history, that at least that question had been taken off the table. And of course that turned out not to be the case too. For within a decade, as the newly unified European continent was seeking to organize itself legally and constitutionally, a fierce argument, which got, unfortunately, very, very little attention on this side of the Atlantic, broke out over whether one word could be cited in the preamble to the European Constitutional Treaty that was to govern the newly expanded European Union. And that word was Christianity. Could Christianity be cited in the preamble to that treaty as one of, not the only, but one of the sources of contemporary Europe's commitment to human rights, the rule of law, democracy, civility, tolerance, and all of the good stuff? As it happened, those who argued in favor of that inclusion, who ranged simply in Polish terms from the then Pope John Paul II to the then President of Poland, a former communist, lost the argument. And while an anodyne reference to religious traditions was wedged into the Constitutional Treaty, which was then, of course, defeated in the Netherlands and France for reasons having nothing to do with these matters, it did seem that something serious was afoot here. In a process which the chairman of the convention described, Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France, self-consciously compared to 1787 and the U.S. Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, although he said he wanted to be the Thomas Jefferson of Europe, perhaps conveniently forgetting that Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, but was in fact living in Paris in 1787. That's okay. That in this really first large-scale attempt in the Western world at a form of constitution making that hadn't been seen for a while, the question of whether there ought to be, there had to be, for the sake of human rights, democracy, civility, the rule of law, tolerance, and all of the good things, a constitutionally mandated European naked public square in which religiously grounded moral argument was viewed with deep dubiousness, if not hostility, arose in 2003-2004 and has not been settled, obviously, to this day, as recent court decisions in Italy and Poland, which I can get into later if you like, amply demonstrate. A similar set of problems having to do with the exercise of what had always been understood to be within the realm of religious freedom has come from our neighbor to the north. David Novak describes one of these problems in his book, the Mark Hall case in Ontario, having to do with what were the boundaries of the acceptable for prom night policy for a Catholic high school in the province of Ontario, which, as you know, receives government funding. David can perhaps discuss that later if he likes. There have also been attempts by Canadian human rights commissions to freeze the exercise of religious freedom in the form of Christian preaching by bringing certain Protestant ministers who have taken a very strong and traditional line on the question of the morality of homosexual acts to book on this, and in some cases these men have found themselves facing severe fines. In our own American situation, let me just quote from my colleague Jody Bottom at First Things in the December issue of the magazine on some interesting issues and controversies that suggest that these issues are not at all settled in our public life today, however much we might have imagined 20 years ago that religious freedom would be the least of our worries in the practical order. As Jody wrote, a California court penalizes doctors for referring a patient to another clinic because they didn't want to perform in vitro fertilization for an unmarried couple. The state representative in Connecticut submits legislation that would force the Catholic Church to divest itself of its parishes or to turn itself into a wholly operated subsidiary of the state of Connecticut. A judge in Montana decides that health care providers are required to arrange for euthanasia when a patient requests it. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission rules against a college in North Carolina for attempting not to provide its employees with health insurance that covers contraception. A charity in Massachusetts is forced out of the adoption business. The Ninth Circuit attempts to compel a park to remove a memorial cross rather than trade the land with the cross into private hands. A New Hampshire divorce court orders a Christian mother to stop homeschooling because her daughter, quote, appeared to reflect her mother's rigidity on questions of faith. An Illinois druggist is ordered to dispense abortifacients or to close his business. More recently, we had 2 weeks ago the Democratic candidate for senator from Massachusetts announcing that while Catholics might enjoy religious freedom, which she seemed to restrict to the freedom of worship, perhaps, quote, Catholics shouldn't work in emergency rooms. And then, of course, there was the real issue, I would suggest, in the controversy involving the president's appearance at Notre Dame last May, which, as it bears on these questions, has to do with the fact that as I read American religious history, excuse me, for the first time, in a country where Christian denominations have argued about their boundaries and their identity for centuries, have split and divided over this. The state of Rhode Island exists because of one of those arguments and divisions. For the first time in all of that vociferousness, Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans, Methodists, Lutherans of all stripes, for the first time in all of that, the president, in the exercise of his office, injected himself into a Christian community's discussion of its identity and its boundaries, suggesting that he would be one of the arbiters of who were the good Catholics and who were the bad Catholics. Now, none of these particular incidents is a terrible wound to the practice of religion in America. Even when you add them together, they don't add up to anything like a death blow. On the other hand, they do represent a trend that all of us, no matter what our particular policy preferences on the questions engaged, ought to find disconcerting. And that is, namely, the whittling away of what we might call the sphere of religious freedom in the name of other putative goods. This is troublesome in itself, But it also raises questions about the degree to which, on this 50th anniversary year of John Courtney Murray's We Hold These Truths, we still hold one of the truths that Murray suggested formed the intellectual core of what he called the American proposition, namely that society exists prior to the state, both historically and ontologically, and that the state is limited in its offices towards society, as Murray put it. The freedom of religion in America, both in its personal aspects, namely, we must not be coerced into belief, and in its public aspects, the right to bring religiously informed moral judgment into public life, and the freedom of religious institutions to conduct their business according to their best self-understanding, is an absolutely crucial part of the border between society and the state. And if the state encroaches into that territory, which has traditionally been understood to belong to society, then we have a very, very interesting and urgent set of questions down to first principles, which brings us back to some of the theoretical questions my colleagues have discussed before us. I don't mean to at all suggest that we're in a situation like Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV at Canossa, but a set of issues that really could not have been imagined 20 years ago has now put itself on the table because, as I say, of this tendency to whittle away the sphere of religious freedom in the name of other putative goods. And that's a much broader question than religious freedom, although it clearly involves that in a very serious way as well. Thank you.
David, you have the floor to...
Okay, I think we can now be seated.
Is this working?
First of all, is it?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, let me express my profound thanks to Bill Galston for raising some of the very profound philosophical questions and perhaps even objections to what was argued for in this book. And my thanks to George Weigel for fleshing out the political problem of religious liberty with keen examples. Picking up with George first, Thomas asked me to mention what the Mark Hall case was, which is discussed in the book. There's a very peculiar arrangement in Canada in general, and in the province of Ontario, where I live in particular, in terms of church-state relations. I mean, people frequently ask me, since most of my life was spent in the United States, what's the difference between living in the United States and Canada? And in lots of ways, it really isn't very different. But when it comes to questions of church-state relations, it is a fundamentally different scene in many respects. I mean, even Canadian Jews have very, very different views of the relation of church and of religion and state to American Jews. The Mark Hall case reflects a very interesting phenomenon, is that in the province of Ontario, Catholic schools receive state funding. This has been argued why only Catholic schools. It should be either other religious groups or none, or whatever. It has a historical basis, and that is that at the Confederation in 1867, when Canada came into being as a nation and the Dominion of Canada, it was primarily a marriage between Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada, Lower Canada being Francophone Quebec, and Upper Canada being Anglophone Ontario. The assumption was that if you're an Anglophone, you're an Anglophone English Protestant, and if you're a Francophone, you're a Francophone French Catholic. What happened to Anglophone Catholics in Ontario? And the way it's been explained to me, actually by a friend of mine who wrote a dissertation on this subject, is that they were very concerned that Anglophone Catholics in Ontario would hook up with their Catholic brethren in Quebec, which was rather unlikely, but nonetheless that was a fear, and therefore this was in effect an entitlement to keep them within English Canada. Now, that being said, the Mark Hall case was Mark Hall, a young man at a Catholic high school in Oshawa, which is a town just outside of east of Toronto, openly professed homosexual, requested that to the school prom, he was in the senior class of his high school, that he be allowed to bring his gay partner. The school said that this is contrary to the teaching of the church. This is not something that we endorse, and therefore this was denied, and therefore he sued in not just the Human Rights Commission, but actually sued in the courts, the Superior Court of Ontario, indicating that his charter rights, that is the Charter of Rights and Responsibility of the Canadian Constitution, had been violated. And because this was considered to be a case of civil rights, it was a case of the civil rights of Mark Hall being, in effect, trumping the religious right of this Catholic school to say that this is simply not part of our policy. And the argument that was made in court on behalf of Mark Hall was, well, after all, a prom is a kind of secular event. We're not telling them whom they can serve communion to or not. But what indicated, I mean, there were a lot of strange things in terms of the case. I mean, first of all, Mark Hall was not being forced to go to a Catholic school. I mean, if he or his parents disagreed with the policies of the school, their public schools are secular public schools are readily available. But this was perceived as an assault on the religious liberty of a community. And I stress the difference between the liberty of a community and the liberty of individuals. So much of our current, what are called rights talk, to quote Marianne Glendon's wonderful book on the subject, that all rights devolve on the individual. And many have seen, even many liberals have seen, that this really kind of places too much upon the individual. And what are the claims of society itself? Now, if one looks upon religious affiliation as not the exercise of an individual preference, but rather the exercise of my right to be member of what I would consider to be a primal community, which is both historically and in terms of metaphysically prior to not only the state, but even to civil society, then it's a question of which right takes precedence, especially when Mark Hall or anybody like him was not being coerced into the practices or the teachings of this particular community. So this becomes a tension, great tension, between what we might consider to be individual rights and what we might consider to be what Charles Taylor, Canada's preeminent philosopher, refers to as group rights. So that is what is being brought to bear. And I think that in the various cases that George has cited, this becomes the question is that even, and the Mark Hall is the question that's being raised, namely in terms of the practice of the moral teachings of my tradition, which I consider to be publicly arguable, at least when they pertain to interhuman relations of most kinds. But that is one thing to argue. So they argue the case of, can a doctor be required to perform an abortion, or other examples that were brought. But this is a case that's even more severe, because this is not somebody who is, the Oshawa Catholic school was not taking its morality in the public square and then, would have to argue, are you ramming your religion down my throat? But rather, they were practicing the teachings of their own church, which does receive government funding, whether that is good or bad is something else, and on their own turf, so to speak. And even there, this was being questioned. And in fact, I think that in a direct response to that and other challenges, what happened in Ontario before same-sex marriage became actually the practice now throughout Canada, as passed by Parliament, is that there were a number of Protestant clergy, whom we wouldn't consider of an evangelical, that is a more conservative line, who simply removed their names from the marriage registry, and so that they could no longer function as in any way clerks of an institution of which they no longer could regard as morally legitimate. They would simply perform these type of ceremonies. This would be a separation, as it were, of church and state. And interestingly enough, one of the interlocutors that I kind of regularly have public debates with is Martha Nussbaum, and at our last performance at Stanford Law School in April, or actually coming out in the California Law Review, we both argued as a fallback position that we might come to a point where we simply have civil unions, and marriage is, as we understand, is reserved for religious communities. In fact, that's the way it is in Israel, except there are no civil unions there. But there are civil unions. There are regular charter flights to the island of Cyprus, which de facto, if not de jure, do the job, and then they're ex post facto they're recognized. So that is, and I very much recognize this, and indeed, George and I came together. Basically, it was a little less than 20 years ago when our late lamented teacher and friend, Father Richard John Newhouse of blessed memory, began his whole enterprise of the Institute on Religion and Public Life and First Things, recognizing that people of faith that hold these positions and think that they are publicly arguable on moral grounds are going to be backed into some corner and at best tolerated in some way that extreme Mennonite groups, the Amish, are tolerated simply because there are too few of them, and why bother, and this sort of thing, which couldn't very well be the case. So this is that he calls this to mind. I would just say to George, however, that the question of society being prior to the state, I agree with fully. But I don't think that the priority of civil society to the state, which I would accept, is strong enough to put a curb on the state. I'm just now doing some research in the debates between Hans Kelsen, Carl Schmitt, and later Leo Strauss on the whole question of which emerged from the Weimar experience. Was civil society strong enough there to place this? It has to be much more of a Gemeinschaft. It has to be much more of a community with deeper historical roots or communities, as it were. Just finally, so before we can open up discussion to Bill's really deep and critical in the best sense of the term reading, and I just want to make very of his many points, but his last point, which was meant to be, I think, the kind of the clincher, as it were, about the question of mediated claims. Mediated claims. I would argue that the difference between a religious communal experience where rights are exercised and one that we might consider to be secular is that morality, as we understand it, emerges from the respective claims and counterclaims we make upon each other as persons, both as individual and collective. And the difference, a right is basically a justifiable claim. And there are justifiable claims and unjustifiable claims. When one, I think, pushes deeper, one argues in some way that these claims are because of a claim that God makes upon God's creatures to live, to pursue their liberty and to pursue their happiness, as understood as by Pelagia Lewinska, for example, who understood that a claim was being made upon her, although at that point, like the children of Israel crying, not knowing that their cry was going to God, but it did. So this is the question of a mediated claim in a religious community. the claim is granted, originally heard through human voices, but at a certain point when one reaches one's maturity, one gets that claim directly from God, and it becomes, in effect, direct rather than mediated. And this was a point that actually was in his own way recognized by one who could be considered the founder of a type of modern secularism, and certainly a type of Jewish secularism, Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza argued that first and foremost, that the claims of the ancient Hebrew state were not only to be imitated, not emulated, but imitated because they'd been so successful in running a society until it degenerated into what he considered priestcraft, but also because in the society, and this is an interesting, very important claim that's often missed by advocates of Spinoza, is that in this society, every citizen of the society, every member of the society had direct access to the sovereign, unmediated access to the sovereign. So that my argument is that outside of these communities as mature adults, we experience these claims as mediated claims, that ultimately the claim comes from God as mediated through the image of God, that which are human persons. That what the community of revelation requires one to brings out is that one therefore gets the claim in a direct sort of way. Now, one does not have to accept that as a premise from which one deduces morality. Rather, I think that premise best informs morality, the morality that many of us would like to see endorsed by a democratic state. But, as I say, informs it, grounds it, but not in any way, in any sort of deductive sort of way. And in that way, one, of course, has to argue for the superiority of what one considers to be the necessary grounding. But that in no way indicates that it's an either-or situation, that therefore anybody else who argues from different grounds, I consider the different grounds to be not as sufficient as the grounds that I'm arguing for, but certainly can't clearly be invoked and indeed inspire people to do what we want society to do, which is to protect the rights of persons and promote the common good.
Okay. From Spinoza to Kant, to post-Kant, to John Courtney Murray, to Richard John Newhouse and John Rawls. Let's now turn to you. I know that probably Bill and George would like to respond to some of the things that have been said, but let them couch their responses and their answers to your questions. So if you have one, stick your hand up. Do we have a mic back there? If we don't, it's okay. People can speak loudly, and if you would, it's okay, Melinda. I think this is a small enough room to where people can be heard. If you would speak up, identify yourself. If I could perhaps start myself, I'll ask this of David and ask Bill and George if they want to chime in. I mean, there's been a great deal said about the restrictions on what one might call freedom of conscience, but as David has just said, involves religious communities as well. To pick a case in the United States, which I don't think was in the litany that George gave us from Jody Bottom, it is the case of Catholic charities in Massachusetts, in the diocese of, I guess, the Archdiocese of Boston, in which Catholic charities was faced with the situation where it refused to place orphans, as it had been doing for decades, into the home of a lesbian or a gay couple, and by doing so was traducing, I believe, state law in this case. So my question for David and George and Bill as well is, on what grounds of religious freedom should a religious community or a religious individual have the right to refuse to comply with, let's say, and I'm not sure where this law came from, I think it was the legislature of Massachusetts, but even if it wasn't, let's assume duly constituted legislative authority has established the right of gay couples to take orphans and to raise them. On what basis, on what religious freedom basis, ought the Catholic Church or a Jewish community or a Muslim community be entitled to refuse to comply with those laws?
I'm not sure of the legalities. I mean, I'm aware of the case, but I'm unaware of the legalities. I would wonder that. I mean, I just would like to know that when Catholic Charities is handling adoptions, can obviously somebody is signing over these children, their natural mother or father, to them to therefore to place them in homes that will eventually, I guess, adopt them. Do the people who are doing this have a right to say that I'm turning my child over to Catholic Charities? I could turn over my child to some other agency or whatever, because I want this child that I've produced that I can't or won't raised in in the type of home of which the Catholic Church approves. If that's being challenged, then I think it's an interesting challenge to religious liberty. I just don't know the case, but it is somewhat questionable because certainly nowadays, I mean, it has been the case that in Jewish communities, it was quite clear that Jewish social service agencies were handling children that they're pushing. Not the case any longer because there are simply very few Jewish children that are really available for adoption. I mean, born of Jewish mothers, and clearly that was the intention of their natural parents. Now, I don't know what the legalities are when you turn your child over to an agency to place up for adoption or whatever, but it is somewhat frightening to think that this is the case. I mean, unless Catholic Charities was already placing children in homes that were not Catholic, or in other homes where there were other infringements of what is prohibited by the Catholic Church. I just don't know enough about it, but it does raise my suspicions and fears that this is one more encroachment on a secular state, especially in the presence of secularist bureaucracy, attempting to exercise moral hegemony over the society, which I consider to be in itself undemocratic or anti-democratic, because it seems to me that a democratic society does not make ultimate claims upon its citizens.